Tonight we're going to look at a fairly main character. Let's make sure I have that on, be braced in case it comes on. We're going to look at a fairly main character from the Bible's history. We're going to learn about the story of Joseph from the Old Testament. And he has a pretty big story in the Old Testament. There's about 13 chapters in Genesis devoted to Joseph. We're only going to look at a small part of that. And let me give you a little background to who Joseph is. Joseph's great-grandpa was Abraham. His grandpa was Isaac, and his father was Jacob. Jacob was the guy that God renamed to Israel. And Israel had 2 wives, 2 concubines, and 12 sons. And Joseph, who we're talking about, was the favorite son of the favorite wife. So, talk about setting your family up for failure from the get-go. But, so as the favorite son, Israel gave him this coat of many colors, this really fancy coat, and the Broadway musical, Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, is loosely based on the life of Joseph from the Bible. So, God gave Joseph a prophetic dream that all his family would one day kind of bow before him as their ruler. And he made the dumb mistake of telling that dream to his brothers, who already didn't like him. They already resented him for being daddy's favorite. And so after this, they said, okay, we're going to kill him. But instead of doing that, the opportunity came by to sell him into slavery so they could make a profit from the prophet. So they sold him into slavery. There was this caravan of traders going to Egypt. They got to Egypt. They sold Joseph to a man named Potiphar, who was a wealthy man. He was captain of Pharaoh's army. So this is where we're going to pick up in the story. We're going to look at Genesis 39, verses 5 through 12. So could I get some loud vocal volunteers to be our random reading row tonight?
I can take this.
All right.
I can take this one. Be really loud. From the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had, in house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge. And because of him, he had no concern about anything but the food he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance, and after a time his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Behold, because of my master has no concern about anything in this house, and he has put everything that he has in my charge. He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness, I sin against God?" And as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her, to lie beside her or to be with her. But one day, when he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men were in the house, was there in the house. She caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and got out of the house.
All right, thank you. So we're going to use this small part of Joseph's story to address the big topic of temptation. And the application tonight will be useful for any type of temptation, not just sexual temptation like the story is about. It can apply to any temptation. And could anyone use some help in combating temptation in their life? I think every one of us could raise our hand for that. So, we're going to look at 4 steps to effectively combat temptation from Joseph's story. 4 steps to effectively combat temptation. First one is recognize temptation. Number 1 is recognize temptation. And we won't get this directly from Joseph's story, but it's implied in there. The text described Joseph as being well-built and handsome. And the fact that Mrs. Potiphar found him attractive enough that she wanted to seduce him gives us the idea that she was into looks, and probably into her own looks as well. And the fact that Potiphar was a wealthy, powerful, influential man who worked for Pharaoh directly, you could imagine that Potiphar's wife was a very attractive woman. So, this was not a situation where she started to come on to Joseph, and he's like, ew, get away. He was probably very attracted to her. Joseph didn't deny being tempted. He refused it. Joseph didn't deny being tempted. He refused it. Verse 10 said that Mrs. Potiphar started coming after him daily, but Joseph refused the temptation. He recognized it as temptation, and he fought it. So it's helpful for us to understand how temptation works. And not everybody grasps this, but temptation is not sin. Temptation is not sin. It's the initial thought that leads to sin if we run with that thought. Temptation is the initial thought that leads to sin if we accept that thought and run with it. So let's look at Hebrews 4:15. I'll go ahead and read that. Hebrews 4:15, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet did not sin. So when Jesus lived on the earth as a man, he was tempted. He experienced temptation just like all of us, but he didn't sin. So the temptation itself isn't sin. He never gave in to it. And having that initial thought does not mean automatic failure. When we think, oh, I'm tempted, might as well give up. That's not the way it should work. Temptation doesn't mean the battle's over. Temptation means that this new battle has just begun. So once we've accepted Christ, we have the Holy Spirit living inside us to guide us and counter those temptations. There's always an escape option. We just have to want to take it. There's always an escape option. We just have to want to take it. 1 Corinthians 10, verses 12 through 13 talks about that. It says, therefore, if anyone who thinks that he stands, take heed lest he fall. No temptation is overtaking you that is not common to man. God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape, that you may be able to endure it. So God will provide an escape route. That escape route might become less and less visible to us as our sin approaches addiction, but there's still always going to be an escape route there. And when we start taking that escape, and once we start experiencing some victories over a certain area of temptation, verse 12 from 1 Corinthians 10 reminds us to keep recognizing it as temptation. Not think that we've become immune to that one. Or else in our arrogance, we might let our guard down and fall to that temptation again. As an example, pornography used to be a big stronghold in my life. And by applying these principles that we're talking about tonight, it's not anymore. And I've got some years of separation from that. But I recognize that I'm not immune to it just because I overcame that area. So by keeping that attitude that I'm not immune to it, it helps me keep my guard up so that I don't fall to it again. That make sense? Okay. Step number two, dethrone the idol. Dethrone the idol. In order to defeat our biggest temptations, we need to dethrone the idol that's behind those temptations. And this is the biggest, most important step that we're talking about tonight. This is the biggest, most important step. even though the next two steps tend to get all the focus when we talk about sin and temptation. Chances are, whatever you've been struggling in your life, can be traced back to one of three root idols. We've talked about this in men's fraternity. Three root idols are control, significance, or comfort. Whatever you wrestle with can probably trace it back to one of those three things. For example, if you ate a whole box of punchkis today, you probably wrestle with the idol of comfort because they just taste good and you want to keep putting them in your mouth. So we can defeat our deepest temptations. We can defeat our deepest temptations. If your internal response to that statement was, well, not my temptations, then right now there's a demon putting that thought in your head to give up without a fight, or to give up without trying again. It's just another temptation. If you think your temptation is too huge of a mountain, that your desire is insurmountable, then listen to this quote by C.S. Lewis. It's a whole paragraph, so I don't expect you to copy it down, but it's helpful to follow along as I read it. If we consider the unblushing promises of reward and the staggering nature of the rewards promised in the Gospels, it would seem that our Lord finds our desires not too strong, but too weak. We are half-hearted creatures fooling about with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered us. Like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at the sea. We are far too easily pleased. Not that our desires are too big, that they're too small. We let ourselves satisfy them too easily. Here's a couple more quotes that are responses to what C.S. Lewis wrote there. David Platt said, Jesus is both the source and satisfaction of our desires. To follow him is to experience an eternal pleasure that far outweighs and outlasts the temporal pleasures of this world. And to your screen from men's fraternity, it said this: the problem isn't desire, the problem is misplaced desire. The problem isn't desire, the problem is misplaced desire. God gave us good desires that are meant to be fulfilled. But temptation is when we have those desires misplaced in the wrong things. See, it's not that our desire for that particular temptation is insurmountable. It's just bigger than our desire for Jesus at that moment. So the solution is to realign our hearts with Jesus. This was huge in overcoming my temptation. When I recognized that those desires were misplaced desires and intended for my wife, intended to know God more deeply, that was the turning point in my battle. And we can't just get rid of temptation. It doesn't work that way. I've tried. It doesn't work. Maybe that's why we fail so often in our temptations. Instead, what we need to do is replace it. Replace temptation by building our desire for God. Replace temptation by building our desire for God. Joseph answered Mrs. Potiphar's advances by reminding himself of who was most important in his life. In Genesis 39:9, he said, "How could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" If he would have slept with Mrs. Potiphar, he would have been sinning against his master, Potiphar. He would have been sinning against Mrs. Potiphar. He would have been sinning against his own body. He only said what was most important. He would have been sinning against God, the person that matters most in his life. We need to replace the lies of temptation with truth. And we should start with the lie that we can't overcome our biggest temptation. That's the first lie we should start to replace. Hebrews 10:18 says, because Jesus himself suffered when he was tempted, he's able to help those who are being tempted. So the power of God to strengthen us, to redirect our thoughts, is only a prayer away. And whatever we're dealing with, he knows it exactly, what we're dealing with, what we're experiencing, what we're going through, because he's been through it. He's been tempted. And he has the power for us to gain a new perspective on it, on the situation, to help us. 1 Timothy 6:6 says, but godliness with contentment is great gain. You know, we think about the fleeting pleasure of the moment of committing some sin. There's great gain when we have contentment being with God. So God gave us good, wholesome desires. We just need to remember that when we're tempted, those desires are misplaced, and only Jesus can truly satisfy our needs. So step 3 is avoid tempting situations. Avoid tempting situations. In Genesis 39:10, when Joseph realized that this was going to be an ongoing battle, it says he refused to even be with her. He tried to avoid her. So that means he was doing his best to avoid this temptation. And I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this point, because this is probably the one that we hear the most. Our friends give us the most advice about this. We give ourselves the most advice about this when we're figuring out how to battle a temptation. We just try to avoid it. But there is a good deal of logic to it. If you're tempted with the idea of premarital sex, don't be with your boyfriend or girlfriend lying on the couch alone in the dark at 2 a.m. You're not avoiding the temptation. If you're tempted with debt, don't go out on shopping sprees. If you're tempted to cut, don't hide sharp things in your room where there's easy access. If you're tempted to gossip, don't hang out with people who do that. Flirting with temptation will lead to disaster every time. Flirting with temptation will lead to disaster every time. So applying just a little common sense and avoiding the tempting situation will help. But if we don't apply all these steps, we're still going to fail. In Job 31:1, Job said he made a covenant with his eyes, basically not to gawk at young women. And that's great, Job. But what happens when you see something that you weren't looking for, as is the case in our culture today? Joseph did his best to avoid Mrs. Potiphar, but eventually she caught up with him. And that leads us into step 4. But before we do that, we're going to do a short group activity. A 1-minute activity. It'll take a minute to explain it, but then we're going to put a timer, a countdown up on the screen. And when that timer reaches 0, whatever happens between now and then, you need to make your way back to your seat so we can move on with step 4. But first, I need 4 energetic volunteers to come up here. 4 energetic volunteers to come up here. Just come on up. We got 2. Okay, we've got it 4. So you guys stay right here. To you 4, this game is dodgeball.
Oh no.
Your goal is to get your beach ball to touch as many people as often as you can in 1 minute. To the rest of everybody here, this game for you is keep away. Except you're not keeping the ball away from them, you're keeping your body away from the ball. You are not allowed to grab the ball or to hit the ball away from them. You're not allowed to touch the ball. Your object is, just a little bit more, your object is to stay as far away from the beach balls as possible without leaving this room. Okay. And by the way, Nathan is off limits because he's videotaping. Okay.
Hey, I'm going to be moving around.
Ready, go.
Don't use me as a shield. Don't use me as a shield.
I like Corey's idea.
Hannah. Hey, Hannah, go get those two. Hey. Hey, Grant. Nate. Grant, go get Nate. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Good job.
Okay. So, we're going to make a little application here. The beach balls represented temptation. So we had 4 people were tempters here. But sometimes, even when we're trying to avoid temptation, trying to avoid sin, it finds us anyways. Sometimes repeated times for some of us. We'll have different strategies. Some people were completely trying to hide from it. Some people were using shields. But the main thing is, temptation's still going to find us even when we're trying to avoid it. So number 4 is flee from temptation when it seizes you. Flee from temptation when it seizes you. Like I said before, step 2, dethroning the idol, is the key point, the most important step. But even when we succeed at that, and that doesn't mean that we don't have to worry about temptation again. Temptation will always be a factor. Temptation will always be a factor. When we dethrone an idol, when we're replacing our old self with the sinful nature with our new self that's designed to be like Jesus. Paul talks about that in Ephesians 4 and Colossians 3. When we start doing that, it's a game changer. But we will still have demons throwing stuff at us and trying to work their deceptions on us, even when we're trying to do the right thing. So let's say we apply these steps. We get through step 3, and we can be minding our own business when suddenly temptation grabs us out of nowhere, like it did with Joseph. So just to review that, Genesis 39, verses 11 through 12. One day he went into the house to attend to his duties. None of the household servants was inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. So he was just doing his job, minding his own business, when temptation seized Joseph, literally, got hold of him. And he fled from the situation. He got out of there. Many years ago at his house at CMU, there's this couple that was dating, and they were sitting on the couch, and it wasn't late at night, it was light out there, but they were alone. They're sitting on the couch just talking. All of a sudden, the guy stands up and walks out the door. Just unexpectedly, didn't say a word. And she's left sitting there on the couch thinking, what the heck just happened? So when he gets home, he calls her and said, I was just starting to feel tempted, so I had to leave. I had to get out of the situation. He did the right thing in fleeing the situation. It probably would have been to her benefit if he would have explained that on his way out. Even when we don't go looking for it, doing our best to make Jesus our greatest desire, temptation will catch up to us simply because there are demons who've made it their purpose to deceive us and tempt us. So when you were minding your own business, so when you are minding your own business and it suddenly catches you, flee. I'm going to read 4 verses in a row here. 1 Corinthians 6:18 says, flee from sexual immorality. Every other sin a person commits is outside the body, but the sexually immoral person sins against his own body. 1 Corinthians 10:14, therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. 1 Timothy 6, verses 10 and 11, for the love of money is a root of all kinds of evils. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs. But as for you, O man of God, flee from these things. Pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, steadfastness, and gentleness. And one more, 2 Timothy 2:22 says, now flee from youthful lusts and pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace with those who call on the Lord from a pure heart. So when temptation comes, put yourself in a different situation, either physically or mentally. When temptation comes, put yourself in a different situation, whether physically or mentally. Maybe you can leave the room and make it go away, or maybe you have to replace your thoughts because you're stuck in a situation. Don't just stand there and stoically try to resist. It's not a battle of willpower, because that usually doesn't get us very far. If you want to win, if you want to defeat that temptation, you got to change the situation. Replace it and redirect your thoughts. If you're familiar with the rest of Joseph's story, you may know that Mrs. Potiphar kept the garment that he left in her hand, and she used it to frame Joseph with Potiphar, who was captain guard. So Joseph went to jail. So we might think, well, a lot of good it did Joseph to resist temptation. What's the point of resisting if it's just going to be out of the frying pan and into the fire? Well, after that, Joseph continued to serve God he continued to serve in his situation with a godly attitude. And eventually he became Pharaoh's right-hand man, and he was ruler over all of Egypt, and he saved everyone from a huge famine that covered the whole Middle East. And if Joseph had failed, could God have raised up a different person in that situation? If Joseph fell to his temptation, God could have done that. But Joseph didn't fall to his temptation. He escaped it, and God did great things through him because of that. And he can use us too if we apply this escape plan. God knows us intimately. He knows who we are. He knows where we live. And he does not expect perfection. He doesn't expect that we'll never, ever commit another sin for the rest of our life. But if we break free, if we escape from some major strongholds in our lives, God will have something great waiting. If we escape from some major strongholds in our lives, God will have something great waiting. Let me pray.